21st century's when it all changes. And you gotta be ready.
Who are you?
Torchwood.
Special access, he said.
For who?
Torchwood.
We're separate from the government, outside the police, beyond the United Nations.
Owen Harper, Gwen Cooper. Toshiko Sato, Susie Costello. And this is Yanto Jones.
And who are you then?
Captain Jack Harkness.
You're an alien capture.
Yes, I am.
Fought any good aliens?
Tons of them.
That's a hell of a job.
Torchwood. Coming soon to BBC Three.
Soon, all of us will have to make the switch to digital TV, so for independent advice, call 08456 50 50 50. Why wait for the switchover?
Newsnight now on BBC Two with Jeremy Paxman.
He listens to no one, answers to no one, and now he's let off an atom bomb. What's the rest of the world to do? Tonight, the world's most reclusive and eccentric state seems to have developed a nuclear bomb. They certainly set off an explosion this morning. Does the world have either the will or the means to stop them going further? We talked to President Assad of Syria about whether he was behind the murder of Lebanon's former Prime Minister and whether he's sending terrorists into Iraq. Google buys out the copyright bad boys of YouTube. Can they tame the wilder reaches of the internet? And welcome to Goldilocks Theory. Does our universe really rest on the back of a giant turtle?
The whole thing looks very contrived, very ingenious, but very contrived. But what's going on?
Good evening. The regime in North Korea warned the other day they were about to test a nuclear device. Soon after 1:30 GMT this morning, they did it. A smiling newsreader invited the world to applaud. Not one country did so. The UN Security Council united in condemnation, but words are easy. What action to take? What action can anyone take? If you're a neighbour, isn't the most tempting option to go nuclear yourself? First tonight, Tim Huell reports.
In the exciting days when the entire people across the country are making a great leap forward in building a great prosperous and powerful socialist nation, the field of scientific research of the DPRK successfully conducted a safe and ground nuclear test on October 9th, July 95 of 2006.
After nearly 2 decades of striving for the bomb, the announcement marks an apparent triumph for what's probably the world's most repressive regime. For most major powers, it spelled the failure of years of diplomacy. It was a blast a kilometre underground in a horizontal shaft at or close to this test site near the northeast coast of North Korea that caused a tremor US seismologists measured at 4.2 on the Richter scale. Some scientists aren't yet convinced it was a nuclear blast. Others are, but say the test didn't live up to North Korea's expectations.
It may very well be that they are now the champion worst nuclear weapons designers and builders on the planet. As nearly as we can tell from the seismic indications that have come out, this is a half a kiloton test. If used against a city, a densely populated part of a city like the city of London at the right time of day, you could kill everybody within about a quarter of a mile radius. Now, who's in a quarter of a mile radius? Probably about 20,000 people in the city, and more would die from fallout. Now, if they had gotten the size bomb one might have expected, then it would have been everybody within a half a mile or three-quarter mile radius.
But that doesn't mean the next test won't be more powerful. North Korea's successful pursuit of a nuclear deterrent shows the toothlessness of the international arms control agreements in the face of a determined regime. It's thought to have assembled its first 1 or 2 nuclear warheads by about 1990. But since it withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty 3 years ago, scientists believe North Korea has built a further 4 to 6. America said it won't accept North Korea as a nuclear power, but the six-party talks aimed at persuading it to give up its weapons program have been stalled for a year. Even pressure from the regime's main supporter, China, has had no effect up till now. North Korea already has the technology, according to some foreign experts, to mount nuclear warheads onto its missiles. What's uncertain is how far those missiles can reach. North Korea's long-range missile, the Taepyeong-2, failed in tests in July. It fell from the sky after just 40 seconds, suggesting the United States is still safe from any possible North Korean attack. But at least 4 shorter-range missiles were successfully tested. It's thought they can reach up to 800 miles, making Japan a potential target. And the South Korean capital, Seoul, where there were protests against the test today, will be within very easy range of a nuclear bomb.
I don't think they're going to use it just tomorrow morning or next month or next year to attack Seoul. I think what they'll probably try to make clear is that if somebody puts a boot on their soil, then they will attack Seoul.
In the past, America certainly considered airstrikes against North Korean nuclear installations, but now there's a growing realization that a military response would be too dangerous.
I think anyone who is considering a military option to actually attack North Korea would have to be concerned about the repercussions of North Korea unleashing 10,000 artillery shells on the capital of South Korea, Seoul, and killing 1 million people. I don't think a military strike on North Korea is going to have very much consideration. I mean, it'll be looked at, but it was looked at in 1994, and it was abandoned then. And right now, it's even harder to think that a military strike, airstrikes, could take out North Korea's program. But military options more widely, possible blockade type.
In 1962, the US blockaded Cuba to force Soviet nuclear missiles out. Now it may have to impose an embargo on North Korea to keep nuclear material in. But any further sanctions that might cause suffering to the North Korean people could send an unwelcome flood of refugees over the border into China or provoke unpredictable political turmoil within the country.
North Korea is a black box. Nobody knows what's going on in the regime, how strong Kim Jong-il is. I mean, when he takes these provocative steps of testing missiles and testing weapons, it may be because he's trying to show those around him that he's still powerful and can stand up. He might be under internal threat.
The UN recognizes only 5 states as official nuclear powers, but India, Pakistan and Israel now also have the bomb. With North Korea, that makes 9 nuclear states. Many experts believe Iran could soon join the club. And among North Korea's neighbors, some say Japan is just a screwdriver turn from having a bomb.
Yeah, Japan has everything. It could produce nuclear weapons in weeks at the most, or even days. So Japan is a latent nuclear weapon power. It has all it needs to have nuclear weapons, just probably a matter of putting them together.
In the face of North Korea's defiance, Japan publicly insisted today it would keep its own ban on atomic weapons. South Korea, however, warned of a possible nuclear arms race. For all the concentration on diplomacy at the UN, East Asia's become a considerably more dangerous part of the world.
Well, we're joined from the UN by our correspondent there, Laura Trevelyan. What's the feeling at the UN then, Laura?
Well, I think the feeling is that it's very important, having had a unified condemnation of North Korea's nuclear test, to now have a unified diplomatic response to that test. And that, of course, is the very difficult bit. Now, President Bush, of course, was sounding pretty cross with Pyongyang today when he spoke. Here's what he had to say.
The United States condemns this provocative act. Once again, North Korea has defied the will of the international community, and the international community will respond. This was confirmed this morning in conversations I had with leaders of China and South Korea, Russia and Japan.
So what's going to happen? Well, already the Americans are circulating a draft resolution which calls for very targeted sanctions against North Korea. They're trying to halt the sale, the production of any kind of materials that could be used to make nuclear weapons. They also want inspections on cargo going in and out of North Korea. Now, the reason these sanctions are so tightly targeted is because the Americans want to get the Russians and the Chinese to support them. The Russians and the Chinese don't want broad sanctions which could cause the complete collapse of the regime in North Korea. Whether or not this resolution will pass, we'll see. Early indications are that there's going to be a meeting of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council tomorrow. By that time, the ambassadors will have got their instructions from Moscow and Beijing, and we'll see where we go from there.
And all this happens, of course, on the day that the UN has just chosen a new Secretary General from South Korea.
Ban Ki-moon, of course, South Korea's foreign minister and also trade minister. Now, Ban Ki-moon campaigned for the job of UN Secretary General, saying that he was going to bring influence to bear with North Korea because he headed up the talks with North Korea over their nuclear ambitions. Now, some diplomats are saying the fact that North Korea had this test shows the failure of South Korea's policy, but Ban Ki-moon has said he wants to visit North Korea at the earliest possible opportunity, and it may be that, as it's going to be high in his in-tray, it may be a good thing that he has knowledge of the region.
Laura, thank you. Well, we're joined now from Washington by Bill Clinton's advisor on North Korea, Wendy Sherman, and we're joined from Westminster by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, William Hague. Can we start with you, Ambassador Sherman? How do we find ourselves in this mess?
We are indeed in a mess. This is a very dangerous security situation for the Korean Peninsula and for the world. We in part found ourselves in this mess because I must say the Bush administration, the administration of the United States, has not really wanted to engage with North Korea. It did so reluctantly, and when Ambassador Chris Hill went to negotiate in direct talks within the six-party talks after years of President Bush not wanting to do that, he went to that negotiation with nothing in his pocket. So on one hand, it is a failure of U.S. administration policy, but it also is a North Korea regime that sees itself out of options and figures it might as well go ahead and show the world that it has nuclear weapons, see what it can get for them, have the awesome kind of pride that comes from being part of that club, which is a disastrous way to get pride and dignity, and use that power and leverage in negotiations.
We'll discuss what the rest of the world could do about it in a moment or two, but I just want to be clear what you fear. Do you fear an arms race, a nuclear arms race among North Korea's neighbors, or are you actually fearing nuclear war, some sort of holocaust or something?
I am very fearful of a nuclear arms race on the Korean Peninsula, although Japan today reaffirmed that it will not move to having nuclear weapons. I don't think that's a final decision, and I think they have to be very concerned about whether the U.S. nuclear umbrella, which was supposed to keep North Korea from building nuclear weapons, that didn't work, and so therefore does Japan need its own deterrent capability. But I also think we have to worry about the really most fundamental thing, and that is that North Korea gets desperate enough to sell its nuclear weapons or fissile material, to trade them, or not secure them well enough so the terrorists can get hold of the material. And for the 21st century, all around the world, the greatest threat are nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists, non-state entities who threaten all of our lives.
William Hague, are you as unimpressed as Ambassador Sherman is by the way the Bush administration has handled this threat?
No, I think she was maybe being a little unfair to her own country, and we might be seeing a little bit of the US midterm elections going on there. It is very important to remember what's been offered to North Korea over the last few years by the 5 parties that have had, the 5 countries that have had talks with it, one of which is the United States, which have included generating all of its electric power, allowing it to build a light water nuclear reactor, provided it didn't go on to have nuclear weapons, giving it security guarantees.
All of which some people call appeasement.
Well, it's not possible, therefore, to say that things haven't been offered to North Korea. And thinking about this sensibly, these situations always involve sticks and carrots. And Libya is a success case, of course, where the sticks and the carrots have worked, and Libya has been diverted away from a nuclear weapons program into a much more constructive contact with the West. Here we probably need now a bit of a bigger stick and a slightly more distant carrot.
Okay, we'll come to the stick and carrot in a moment, but just at a philosophical level, since we, the United States and various other countries, have turned a completely blind eye to Israel acquiring a nuclear bomb, Pakistan and India, why shouldn't North Korea have one?
Well, because of some of the things the ambassador there was just talking about. One of them is the sale of weapons to other countries. You'll remember that a few years ago the Spanish Navy intercepted a North Korean ship which was illegally carrying Scud missiles to the Yemen. And there's lots of other evidence of the sale of military equipment from North Korea to the rest of the world. So here you have one of the highest possible risks of proliferation. And that's why one of the actions that needs to be taken is the strengthening of what's called the Proliferation Security Initiative to try and keep that nuclear technology, as was said in your report, in North Korea.
Okay. Let's look at what might be done now then. We are where we are now. The North Koreans clearly have developed technology. They have some sort of nuclear explosive device. What is the next step for the rest of the world, Ambassador Sherman?
The next step for the world after the condemnation, after the sanctions, there should be consequences for actions, is to get North Korea back to the negotiating table because they still do have those nuclear weapons. We do have the potential of an arms race or loose nukes or trading in nuclear materials. And so we do have to keep trying to bring North Korea into the international community. This is very tough. This has gotten tougher. Although the Shadow Foreign Minister is quite correct that a proposal was put on the table, at the same time that a proposal was put on the table, though it didn't include all of the elements that he mentioned, we also had a United States on a parallel track sanctioning North Korea around its counterfeiting and freezing its assets.
But those
none of us want North Korea to counterfeit, but that should be part of a structured negotiation, not a parallel track. It gives out mixed messages. So yes, sticks, yes, carrots, but employed in one negotiating framework.
Let's talk sticks then, William Hague. Sanctions?
Yes, I think it's very important to have some sanctions. I think actually the credibility of the UN Security Council is now at stake because it's passed resolutions on this before. It's passed resolutions on Iran as well, where deadlines have come and gone and no action has been taken. So if nothing happens after this, then I think it will be very difficult ever to say to a proliferating state again that the United Nations will ever do anything about it.
Yes, but
so it is important to have some sanctions.
Absolutely. The problem has been, though, with sanctions in the past that all sorts of exceptions were made on so-called humanitarian grounds, perhaps absolutely justifiable humanitarian grounds. Are you saying that if necessary there has to be starvation, for example, in North Korea?
Well, I hope not. I certainly would hope that the sort of thing the United States has proposed tonight, which from the sound of what our Foreign Secretary said earlier today, Britain would support, would be the kind of thing that would be adopted, which would be targeted sanctions, not sanctions that would create a humanitarian crisis. It's more important, I think, to get China and Russia to agree to a package of sanctions than it is to get a particular package of sanctions. Maintaining that unity on the Security Council is very important, but critical that they do something to send the signal, the right signal, that they will not be treated in this way.
Ambassador Sherman, briefly, finally, do you think there is a peaceable way out of this?
I think it is a very, very difficult road. It has been made more difficult over the last few years, but it is something we must work very hard at making happen. The world's security depends on it.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks. Now, one of the countries to which George Bush alleges North Korea has exported her missile technology is Syria. It didn't make it into Bush's axis of evil first time around, but soon got added. The regime's being blamed for the assassination of the former Lebanese Prime Minister and for filtering terrorists into Iraq. Syria shares borders with Israel, Lebanon and Iraq. It's already subject to American sanctions, and every move by the Syrian government is closely scrutinized for hints as to its intentions. This summer the country supported Hezbollah in its war against Israel on the southern Lebanese border. In a rare interview, the Syrian leader, President Bashar al-Assad, has spoken to the BBC's World Affairs editor John Simpson. We'll hear from the president shortly. Before that, John Simpson gives the background.
For a brief moment, back in 2000, it looked as though there'd be big changes in Syria. The fierce old president Hafez al-Assad was gone, and his mild-mannered son Bashar, who'd been an ophthalmologist in North London, took over. There was a brief Damascus spring. Political prisoners were freed. Independent newspapers appeared. But the hopes soon faded. It wasn't altogether the new President Assad's fault. On the 11th of September 2001, his 36th birthday, the attacks in New York and Washington forced him to choose between opening up more to the West and resisting American interventionism in the Middle East. Soon, insiders in Washington talked grimly of regime change in Syria. Things got worse. In February 2005, Someone blew up the Lebanese Prime Minister, Rafik Hariri. Syrian agents had done so much of that in the past that Damascus immediately got the blame. There were huge demonstrations in Beirut. Cedar Revolution, it was called. The pro-Syrian Lebanese government fell, and Syria was forced humiliatingly to pull its army out of Lebanon. An early UN report said Hariri couldn't have been murdered without the knowledge of Syrian intelligence. It got more lurid still. Syria's interior minister, Qazi Karnan, who'd controlled Syrian policy in Lebanon, was found dead in his office. Suicide, supposedly. This summer, Syria backed Hezbollah in the fighting with Israel. Thousands of missiles with which Hezbollah tormented Israel presumably came in from Syria. In Washington, officials declared that Syria was now a full member of the Axis of Evil, and they blamed Assad for allowing insurgents to cross from Syria into Iraq to fight the coalition there. So Bashar al-Assad is under huge pressure. Yet when I met him yesterday, he was calm and thoughtful, with a scholarly precision about his choice of words. He's got two big advantages. Time is on his side, no awkward elections here, and as a result of his defiance of Israel and America, he's genuinely popular in Syria and the wider Middle East. But times are undoubtedly difficult for him, and his options are very limited.
Syria has a really unenviable reputation. In many countries in the West, for instance, the United States has publicly said, or American officials have publicly said that Syria is a member of the Axis of Evil. How do you regard that view of your country, and what can you do about it?
Everybody cares about his reputation, but we care more about the reality. And the reputation is a matter of perception. So the question is, do some in the West perceive the reality in our region as it is, or as they want?
But might it not be better not to have such close links with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and not to have such a close alliance with Iran, not to allow weapons to go to Hezbollah, not to allow insurgents to pass into Iraq from your country?
But the biggest mistake they committed in the West, they use the labels as a base for political actions. There's a big difference. It doesn't matter what you label organizations or people or countries. The most important things in politics, do they have effects or not? As long as they are effective on the ground among the people, you have to deal with them. And when they have the support of the people, you cannot label them as terrorists, because this way you label the people as terrorists, and you cannot say this country is terrorist country, these people is terrorist people. About Hamas and Hezbollah, both are part and parcel of the Lebanese society. And don't believe that there's any organization send its people and members to die for third country. This is not realistic. They die when they have cause. In Iraq, the situation is different. We don't know which party, or if they have more than one party, or there's no party at all sharing the resistance. In Iraq, we have two things. You have the chaos and the terrorism, and you have the resistance. Where our public stand, we condemn every single attack against the civilians and the innocent in Iraq, like these suicide bombers killing tens and sometimes hundreds in one day, while attacking the occupying forces. This is normal. We don't
acceptable.
We accept it or not. It's normal. It's a fact. Wherever you have occupation in the region for the last 150 years at least, you can go back deeper or further in history, but at least for the last 150 years, you have the same reaction in every occupation.
Are you prepared to help the people who kill British and American soldiers?
Mm-hmm. First of all, we are against the occupation, and we warned the British and the American before the war that whenever you're going to win the war, you're going to win it, you're going to ask the whole world to extricate you from this quagmire, and they are in quagmire. Of course, as I said, if it's normal, and we have to accept the normal, of course the resistance is one of our concepts that we adopt, not against the British or the American in particular, as a concept against any occupying forces.
So you do allow insurgents to pass across the border into Iraq?
No, this is something else. Because first of all, the resistance in Iraq is Iraqi resistance. It doesn't come from anywhere outside the border. We don't allow and we don't support because first, for the Iraqis, second, for our interest. Because if you allow terrorists to attack somewhere, anywhere in the world, it will attack you later.
Let me just get this absolutely right. You understand the reasons for insurgency, either against Israel or against the British and American forces in Iraq, but you don't help them. Is that right?
As I have to be very precise about the definition. The insurgency is something against the law. We don't support it. Resistance, we adopt it as a concept. That doesn't mean that you support it with money or with armaments. I'm talking about the political concept, about you adopt it as a right.
You did help Hezbollah with weapons, didn't you?
No, politically. We help them usually politically. But as long as we adopt the concept of and principle of resistance, we're not going to be the guard of the Israeli border who occupied our land. This is a simple thing and self-evident.
American officials are saying they don't think you can or will help with the peace process, so they don't think there's any point in talking to you.
We have to ask them on what basis they said that.
Well, I suppose they say it because they feel that you're not moving towards negotiations with Israel, for instance. Are you prepared to move towards negotiations with Israel?
Yeah, if we draw an analogy with a car, it's not one car with one driver. Peace process have more than one party, and all of them has to drive in the same direction. The conditions to achieve peace are the international conditions. So this is very simple in order not to make it complicated, because if you ask the party, each one has its own vision, you'll make it complicated. Nobody will make concessions at the end. So it's better to be committed to the international will, if you talk about the will, or if you talk about the vision. We are committed to this will and to this vision. Are the Israeli committed to it? You need arbiter. You need impartial arbiter. So this is the role of the United States. This is the supportive role of the United Nations, and this is the supportive role of the European. So far, the United States doesn't have a will to play this role and doesn't have a vision toward the peace.
So would you accept that at some future stage, no matter how long it takes, Syria and Israel could live side by side in peace and harmony, accepting each other's existence?
Peace negotiations connotes what you mentioned, what you're saying, in details. Exactly. It conforms with what you said. Yes, the answer is yes.
Down the decades, Syria's influence in Lebanon has not been regarded by the outside world as being leaning towards peace. It's divided the different groups in the country, and of course most recently there was the murder of Prime Minister Hariri, which one United Nations report said could only have been carried out with the knowledge of the Syrian intelligence system.
The assassination of Hariri has affected Syria as bad as it affected Lebanon. Hariri was a real ally to Syria. He was never against Syria. He supported Syria in many difficult positions and stands. So there was no simple or single reason or convincing reason to push Syria to do such a thing.
Supposing the UN does turn up evidence that Syrian intelligence agents, for instance, who are very active in Lebanon and elsewhere, that they had been responsible. I know this is a hypothetical question, but would you put them on trial?
Whoever proved to be complicit in such atrocity, he's considered as a traitor, and the traitor is, according to our law, should be punished in a very severe punishments.
And John Simpson is with us in the studio now. He's a sophisticated chap, isn't he?
He's quite impressive, yes. In fact, he's very impressive. He's what you might think, actually. I mean, he's a doctor. He was a specialist. He was an ophthalmologist who nobody thought would ever be a political leader in any sense. And he was only plucked there out of London, North London, where he was operating and working, because his brother was killed in a car crash.
Is he really in charge?
Well, I asked him that, and he said yes, but then of course he would. But I think it's pretty clear that he is in charge. He's in charge certainly at the moment. I don't think he's being directed. I used to think he might be directed by a sort of gang of his pretty rough father's old sort of cronies. That doesn't seem to me to be the case.
The very interesting thing he had to say there about coming to some accommodation with Israel. Is that likely in the foreseeable future?
Well, you see, the great thing he's got is that there's absolutely no pressure on him at all. He doesn't have an electorate at his back. He doesn't have to worry about opinion polls. He doesn't have to worry about working on anything that needs results in the short term. He's okay for the moment. He's quite popular because of his support for Hezbollah. In fact, I think he's very popular in Syria just at the moment. And he knows that the Israeli government is weak, can't do a deal, no point in doing a deal with the present Israeli government. He knows that Washington is now really pretty much switched off from the whole thing. No point in doing a deal while George Bush is in power. Or what he'll do is simply wait until there's a strong Israeli government that can deliver and a president in Washington who takes a serious interest.
John, thank you. The American internet search engine company Google has just announced that it's buying YouTube, the site where people post videos they've made or like, for a mere $1.65 billion. Not bad for a company that not long ago was running from an office above a pizza parlor and kept afloat on credit card debts. Google apparently wanted it because of the value it sees in access to a generation who don't watch moving pictures on the box in front of you, but on their laptops. Our business editor, Paul Mason, has the story.
Well, it may not be the biggest business deal ever done, but it is iconic. Google, the internet company worth $130 billion, has taken over YouTube, a website that was only set up 18 months ago and has just 67 employees. It's a whole new ecosystem out there and we're excited to be part of it, said Google's boss. But a minute ago, Google was the new thing. So what does YouTube do and why all the fuss? YouTube is a site that lets you upload video clips, the kind you make on your mobile phone or digital camera. It took off in a big way among the world's teenagers. Last month, Chinese students used it to spread footage of a street protest being broken up. And closer to home, police used it to appeal for witnesses in the shooting of Manchester teenager Jesse James. Despite the grainy pictures, the appeal of making do-it-yourself TV was massive. This graph shows YouTube's place in the world ranking of websites according to who gets most visitors. And look, since the start of the year, it's shot from nowhere to the top 10. But there's been a problem. YouTube tolerated all kinds of copyright infringement. People were uploading stuff they'd ripped off from DVDs, or they were filming the TV screen using their mobile during things like live football. So to pave the way for today's deal, both YouTube and Google had to square things with the big music publishers. They spent the morning signing deals with Sony, Universal, CBS, and Warner. The deal has massive implications. One, Google is now in the content business. This Godzilla of a company, which has already put the frighteners on newspapers, will now compete with organizations like the BBC. Two, Google's reputation for innovation takes a bit of a knock. It had its own video service, but it couldn't match YouTube. So what happened there? Three, the mania for buying companies which basically allow teenagers to network with each other is in full swing. Rupert Murdoch recently paid $500 million for MySpace, and this deal shows social networking is the new .com. The problem? Well, some analysts think social networking is overblown as a concept. The audience for YouTube, Bebo, MySpace, and all the other places you've never heard of if you're over 30 could just move off somewhere else. Especially if YouTube starts censoring the clips more heavily and weeding out all the stuff that's really somebody else's intellectual property.
Now, coming up on the programme, the cosmologists who think science can explain life, the universe and everything. Before that, though, a roundup of today's news. Our main story tonight, the UN Security Council is considering what action to take against North Korea after it tested a nuclear weapon for the first time. There's been widespread condemnation of the action. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, William Hague, told Newsnight it was time to look at sanctions.
I certainly would hope that the sort of thing the United States has proposed tonight, which from the sound of what our Foreign Secretary said earlier today, Britain would support, would be the kind of thing that would be adopted, which would be targeted sanctions, not sanctions that would create a humanitarian crisis. It's more important, I think, to get China and Russia to agree to a package of sanctions than it is to get a particular package of sanctions. Maintaining that unity on the Security Council is very important.
The government announced it plans to start issuing biometric identity cards to foreign nationals in Britain from 2008 and to British citizens a year later. It's also given an estimated cost for the ID card scheme and plans to issue passports with improved security features, putting the total at nearly £5.5 billion over a 10-year period. The killers of Damilola Taylor have been sentenced to 8 years in youth custody. Danny Preddy, who's 18, and his 19-year-old brother Ricky stabbed Damilola in the leg with a broken bottle as he walked home in Peckham in November 2000. One of the most trenchant critics of the Catholic Church, the DUP leader, the Reverend Ian Paisley, has held his first meeting with the head of the Catholic Church in Ireland. His last high-profile encounter with the Catholic dignitary was in the 1980s when he denounced Pope John Paul II as the Antichrist. The markets, the FTSE 100 share index closed up. In New York, there was light trading due to a public holiday. The Dow Jones closed up. Against the euro, the pound, though, was down. Against the dollar, the pound was also down. Now, let's talk Goldilocks. The other day, when we discussed with Richard Dawkins whether God's an invention, 1,200 viewers wrote in to add to the debate. Tonight, we return to the theme. Is it just chance that the universe has the right conditions for life, neither too hot nor too cold, like the third bowl of porridge in the Three Bears house, the so-called Goldilocks enigma? Could it be, rather, that there's some organizing intelligence at work? One for our science editor, Susan Watts.
Time of Isaac Newton, all scientists were effectively religious, and they looked upon their scientific work as uncovering God's handiwork in the heavens. And so they asked the great questions of existence too.
For cosmologists who spend their lives pondering the universe, it's the kind of question they like to mull over on a walk in the park. How is it that the universe is so perfectly poised to support life? So perfect, in fact, that to some physicists, Paul Davies among them, it's all beginning to look like a fixed-up job.
When we look at the underlying laws of the universe, what we find is that there are features to them that seem to be just right for life. And if we imagined that you could play the role of God and twiddle the knobs of the designer machine, and you maybe twiddle one knob and make the electron a bit heavier and twiddle another knob and make gravity a bit stronger. Imagine doing that. You don't have to twiddle those knobs by very much, and you would simply wreck any chances for life to appear in the universe. So what we say is that the parameters that go into the laws of physics seem to be fine-tuned, and if you just detune them a little bit, there could be no life. So the whole thing looks very contrived, very ingenious, but very contrived. What's going on?
What are the leading scientific explanations for that? And what is the leading theological explanation for that?
Many scientists say, well, it's just a lucky fluke that the universe is so well suited to life, that one day we will have a theory which will explain all these numbers, and that's just the numbers they will be. There'll be no freedom for maneuver. And so these people shrug aside life as of no significance. Then another group of scientists say, well, this all looks so contrived that there has to be some explanation to it. And maybe that explanation is that instead of there being one universe, maybe there's a vast multiplicity of them. This is often called the multiverse. So this thing out there that we've all along been calling the universe would just be a tiny component in this much vaster, more elaborate system. The religious explanation is an obvious one, that the universe looks as if it's been designed by some sort of intelligent being, and so perhaps it has been designed.
what alternatives might be out there?
What I would like to find is a scientific mechanism that can explain the relationship between the underlying laws, which are bio-friendly, and the existence of life itself.
The key to understanding Davis's point in this book is getting to grips with his levitating turtle idea. I've got a super turtle here. I think it might be a tortoise, actually. But perhaps you can explain to us the origin of this analogy with turtles.
Well, there's a famous story that's told in discussions of this sort about a lecturer who stands up and gives a lecture about the meaning of the universe, and partway through is interrupted by a woman who said, well, you may be very clever, but I know how the universe is put together. The world is standing on the back of an elephant, which is standing on the back of a turtle. To which the lecturer replies, well, what is the turtle standing on? And she said, you can't fool me, it's turtles all the way down.
And even with the scientific theories, you're saying you end up with having to have faith in the laws of physics, is that right?
That's right. All the explanations on offer for why the universe is as it is depend upon something outside itself, some sort of levitating super turtle that holds the whole scheme up, whether that's an unexplained God or an unexplained set of laws or an infinite number of universes, whatever it is. I'd like to break away from that Tower of Turtles problem and have some explanation for the universe that is contained within itself, so that mathematics, the laws of physics, the universe, life, consciousness, and so on, form a self-sustaining, self-explaining system.
Earlier today, Professor Davis took his turtles into discussion with Michael Frayn, the playwright and philosopher, who also has a new book out that grapples with our place in the universe.
I cannot think how I got myself into the position where I'm discussing in public cosmology with a cosmologist. I think there is a point of convergence between our two books. Without human beings to say something about the universe doesn't have any graspable existence.
My scientific work has convinced me that there is something like a meaning or a purpose to the universe. Now, you have to use those words very carefully. The best I can say is that the universe seems to be about something. There's a coherent scheme of things. I think you couldn't be a scientist without expecting that if we dig deeper and deeper to the next level down, that we will uncover something which is ordered and intelligible.
But you're not looking to a God in the commonly understood sense of religion to be the explanation?
Absolutely not. What I'm trying to do is to build the existence of observers and the existence of laws into a self-explaining, self-sustaining loop, as opposed to just taking something as given.
As if to reassure readers that by the end of the book they've delved further into our origins than even some of our greatest thinkers, Davis ends with a quote from a 1940s radio debate in which Jesuit priest Frederick Copleston tries to coax the agnostic philosopher Bertrand Russell into discussing how we all got here.
But your general point then, Lord Russell, is that it's illegitimate even to ask the question of the cause of the world.
Yes, that's my position.
Well, if it's a question that for you has no meaning, it's of course very difficult to discuss it, isn't it?
Yes, it is very difficult. What do you say? Shall we pass on to some other issue?
Let's.
If you want to discuss Paul Davis's book or anything else in the Newsnight Book Club, you can do so on our glorious website. Now, Martha's here equipped, I'm sure, to talk about cosmic turtles and Bertrand Russell, but instead is going to tell us about prison places and John Reed.
Although he might have been in need of some ingenious cosmological theory today. Yes, John Reed was making a statement in the House of Commons about prison overcrowding, a crisis, a catastrophe, according to the opposition. Something he's been worried about for some time. In fact, we discovered that earlier in the summer, things looked like they were getting so bad. He asked where that prison ship was, unusual for a Labour Home Secretary to do this, and he was told, oh, it would be too expensive to refurbish it, and eventually the officials had to admit that they'd sold it. So he had to come up with some other ways of solving prison overcrowding. The first is he got some extra prison places, 8,000 prison places. He got the money from the Treasury. Although we've been told by a source close to John Reed, in fact, he wanted double that. He wanted 16,000, but wasn't able to get the money from the Treasury for it. The other things he's doing, more controversially, he's going to put some prisoners into police cells. That will be beginning later on this week. It's called Operation Safeguard. And then he's also going going to be moving some prisoners who are in stricter prison regimes into open prisons at the moment. Now, the reason that he gave for why he's in this position of having to bring in these special measures is he says that while judges are prepared to use some of the tougher new sentencing, they haven't been going down the non-custodial route.
The evidence so far is that our courts are making good use of indeterminate sentences so that dangerous people are staying in prison and being retained there for longer, but not yet using community orders as fully as they might. This is the point emphasised this weekend by the Lord Chief Justice.
But that wasn't the most controversial element, was it? That was about foreign prisoners.
Absolutely, and this was the scheme whereby he's suggesting that foreign prisoners are given £2,500 to encourage them to go back to their own countries. Now, that's raised a lot of controversy. If you look at the front page of the Daily Express tomorrow, they're calling it a bribe, as some of the other newspapers are, because they're saying this is taxpayers' money is going into giving prisoners money that actually belongs to the taxpayer. The Home Office argument is that, in fact, this isn't money going directly to the prisoner. It's a kind of resettlement thing. It's to help with housing, to help with education, or to encourage them to go back to their own country.
Be clear about this. You commit a crime in this country, and then the British taxpayer gives you money to start a job in your own country.
Yes, the utilitarian justification being it would actually be cheaper to do that than the cost of a prison place over the cost of a year. But clearly there's a lot of...
Just before we look at the rest of the papers tomorrow, they've got poll news, I gather.
Yes, in the Times there's a story there which has that the Conservatives seem to have lost their post-conference bounce. They've gone down from to just 1 point lead over Labour of 36%, and it shows that David Cameron would actually do better against all the possible replacements, first for Tony Blair, against Brown, Reid and Johnson. Gordon Brown actually making a very important speech tomorrow about security, which he's been keeping John Reid, or attempting to keep John Reid on board about. They met last week about it, and I saw them after today's Parliamentary Labour Party talking today.
I forgot to ask you, of course. It was the first... I'm sorry, don't look at me as if I'm an idiot. I know I'm an idiot. I forgot. I'm sorry. It was the first day back in Parliament after the party conferences, Martha.
Get with it. You're off with the cosmic turtles, aren't you?
I am.
It was indeed, Jeremy, and I'm so glad you asked me about that. It was a meeting of the Parliamentary
Here's an answer I made earlier. Come on.
Which I've ingeniously woven in. But anyway, in fact, Tony Blair addressed the Parliamentary Labour Party after their disastrous, fratricidal summer. He made an appeal for strength and unity, and by and large, there were a couple of calls for Gordon Brown to take over. But in fact, most of the discussion was of issues of policy, things like Trident, for example.
OK, well, I think we better go to the newspapers now, Martha. Let's start with the Times, front page tomorrow morning. The moment that shook the world, that North Korean nuclear explosion, on all the front pages, more or less. There it is on the Times, the Telegraph, there it is again, the Financial Times, the seismograph readout too. Also on the front page of The Guardian, how do you solve a problem like Korea, the Sun, and another pun on the front page of the Daily Mirror, Kim Wilde. Well, that's all from Newsnight tonight. If the whole experience has been too much for you to take in one blast, or you want to catch the North Korean dictator's crazy boiler suit and his haircut again, check out our website, where you can also download a podcast. It might not have the rhetorical flair of the dear leader, but then you don't have to live in North Korea to get it. I'll be back tomorrow night, but until then, good night.
Tomorrow on Breakfast, murder in the Outback. 5 years after her boyfriend Peter Falconio was murdered, Joanne Lee speaks exclusively to me about her long fight for justice. That's Joanne Lee's story tomorrow on Breakfast from 6.
Chimps share 99.4% of our DNA, which is why
you got me.
Danny Wallace is on a mission.
They cooperated. They understood. They're people.
To make us think differently about them.
Ed and the chimp are identical.
Horizon. Chimps are people too. Tomorrow at 9 on BBC Two.
You can't choose your family, but you can find out who they were. That's amazing. Nigella Lawson finds her place in her family's colourful history.
When you have children, you see somehow that there's structure.
Who Do You Think You Are? Wednesday at 9 on BBC One.